It represents a collapse feature, and that is exactly what we're looking for.
Definitely appears to be a tunnel.
So-called treasure location.
Really would like to see what's at the bottom of that shaft.
Is Oak Island's 230-year-old mystery finally reaching its biggest turning point? For centuries, treasure hunters have searched beneath this mysterious island for evidence of what may have been buried there. But now, Rick and Marty Lagina's team is investigating ancient underground evidence that could raise an entirely new question. What if they are getting closer to a hidden structure than ever before? The discovery is especially intriguing because it has been connected to theories surrounding a possible $209 million gold treasure. Underground scans, drilling data, unusual materials, and possible signs of human activity are now adding another layer to a mystery that has refused to disappear for more than 2 centuries. But if these clues really are connected to an ancient man-made structure, then what exactly was built beneath Oak Island? Was it a tunnel, a sealed passage, or something far more significant? And could it finally lead investigators toward the legendary treasure chamber? The answers could change the Oak Island story forever. But before we uncover what the team may have found underground, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because you definitely won't want to miss what comes next in the search for Oak Island's greatest mystery. The operation on Oak Island was moving forward like any other day. Heavy equipment continued breaking into the ground. Drilling crews were bringing up samples from deep boreholes, and the team was documenting every layer they encountered. But then, something surfaced that immediately changed the mood of the investigation. Rick and Marty Lagina's team came across an ancient-looking piece of material buried underground. What made it so interesting wasn't simply its age or appearance. It was the depth where it was discovered, the exact location, and the unusual evidence surrounding it. Suddenly, another possibility had to be considered. Could the team actually be getting closer to a buried structure? Oak Island has produced strange clues before. Researchers have encountered fragments of old wood, unusual stones, and signals that appeared to indicate metal beneath the surface. Certain soil layers have also suggested that humans may have disturbed the ground or carried out some kind of construction activity there long ago. But there has always been a major problem. A single unusual object can never prove the entire Oak Island mystery. This discovery, however, appeared to be different because it came from an area where the team was already investigating possible signs of underground activity. If the material proves to be genuinely ancient, and additional samples from nearby locations point to the same period, then the discovery could become far more significant. And that's where the $209 million treasure theory becomes even more intriguing. Because imagine that the team isn't simply looking at an isolated piece of ancient wood or an unusual stone. What if these materials are actually remnants of something that was deliberately constructed underground? That immediately raises a much bigger question. What would someone have gone through so much effort to build beneath Oak Island? Could it be part of an ancient tunnel? A concealed passageway? Or could the team finally be looking at evidence connected to the sealed chamber that treasure hunters have been searching for across generations? The underground signal that raised new questions. Once the ancient evidence had been identified, the investigation moved toward an even bigger question. Could something much larger still be hidden beneath the surface? The answer couldn't come from the recovered wood, stones, or possible metal traces alone. So the team began examining underground scanning results and drilling information more closely. That's when another intriguing development emerged. Deep beneath the island, certain signals appeared to differ from the surrounding natural formations. In some sections, the density of the ground seemed to change unexpectedly. Elsewhere, the normal layering appeared to be disrupted. But one detail was particularly interesting. Some areas appeared to contain possible straight boundaries, or spaces that could represent underground voids. Of course, a single unusual reading doesn't automatically mean a hidden chamber exists. Underground scanners can be affected by rocks, groundwater, changes in soil composition, and countless other natural features. But the situation becomes much more interesting when similar patterns begin appearing repeatedly. If scans from different directions continue showing the same density change, the same boundary, or a possible void in approximately the same location, it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss everything as random geology. And that's when drilling becomes crucial. As the drill pushes deeper into the island, each core sample provides another piece of information about what is beneath the surface. A sequence of ordinary soil, followed by an unexpected material, then wood or unusual stone, and eventually a potential empty zone could indicate that the underground environment is changing in a very specific way. And if those changes form a straight, contained pattern resembling an enclosed area, the possibility of human construction becomes much harder to ignore. This is where the $209 million treasure theory takes another dramatic turn. The mystery would no longer be simply about whether an old tunnel exists somewhere beneath Oak Island. The much bigger possibility would be this: could Rick and Marty's team be drilling directly above a sealed chamber that was intentionally closed hundreds of years ago? The clue hidden inside the core samples. Even with underground scans suggesting possible voids and unusual boundaries, one critical question remained unanswered. Were these signals actually evidence of human construction, or were they simply natural geological formations? To separate the two possibilities, the core samples became more important than ever. Every piece of material brought up from deep underground could potentially reveal another chapter in Oak Island's history. At first, ordinary soil and rock would tell the team very little. That would be exactly what they would expect to encounter. But the situation changes if, at a particular depth, the drill suddenly brings up something unusual: wood fragments, strange stones, a noticeable change in the soil, or even traces that appear to contain metal. When several unusual materials begin appearing within the same underground zone, the question becomes much harder to ignore. Could these samples be connected to one another? Could they represent different pieces of the same buried structure? And most importantly, could they finally provide the physical evidence needed to determine whether something was deliberately constructed beneath Oak Island? For a mystery that has survived for more than 2 centuries, that could be the clue that changes everything. The real significance of this discovery would depend on more than simply finding old material underground. The depth, location, and relationship between multiple discoveries could be far more important. Imagine that a borehole brings up a fragment of ancient wood from a particular depth. By itself, that wouldn't prove very much. The wood could have occurred naturally, or it could have been left behind by one of the many previous treasure hunting operations. But now, imagine another borehole, drilled some distance away, reaches nearly the same depth, and produces another unusual material. Perhaps more wood, a disturbed soil layer, or a strange concentration of stones. Then, a third borehole reveals something remarkably similar. At that point, the situation begins to change. What looked like an isolated discovery could start becoming a recognizable underground pattern. If samples collected from several separate boreholes indicate that the same layer was disturbed at approximately the same depth, an important question immediately follows. Who disturbed the ground and what were they trying to do? And the mystery becomes even more compelling if underground scans from that same region are already showing a possible boundary or void. Now, there would be 2 different forms of evidence pointing toward the same location: physical samples suggesting unusual human activity, and underground imaging revealing a structure that may not fit the surrounding geology. That combination could make the buried tunnel theory considerably more intriguing. But there was one clue that could potentially change the investigation even further: metal. If possible, metal signals appear in the same underground zone where ancient materials and a potential structure have also been identified, the $209 million gold treasure theory suddenly becomes much harder to ignore. Could all of these clues somehow connect back to Oak Island's legendary money pit? Could the new discovery be connected to the money pit? That became perhaps the most important question facing the team. For nearly 230 years, the money pit has remained at the center of Oak Island's treasure legend. Generations of searchers have excavated the area, invested enormous amounts of money, and created countless shafts and tunnels in an attempt to reach whatever they believed was hidden below. Yet even after all those efforts, the precise nature and even the exact original target remains uncertain. That's why the location of the new evidence matters so much. The team would need to compare the depth, direction, and position of the newly identified underground features with historical information from the money pit area. If an underground boundary or tunnel-like formation appears to extend in the direction of the money pit, the implications could become much larger. Researchers could then compare old excavation records and borehole locations with historical maps and newly generated three-dimensional underground data. The goal would be to determine whether these seemingly separate underground anomalies might actually be connected by one larger system. But then, another possibility emerges. What if generations of treasure hunters have been searching in the wrong place? For more than 2 centuries, countless excavations have altered the ground around the money pit. Shafts have been dug, tunnels have been created, boreholes have been drilled. Entire sections of the island have been disturbed. That makes reconstructing the original underground landscape extremely difficult. And perhaps the feature everyone assumed was the main treasure location wasn't actually the final destination at all. It could have been an entrance, a diversion, a decoy, or even part of a much larger underground route. Meanwhile, the actual target could have been positioned somewhere else. If the new core samples, indications of human disturbance, and possible underground void all begin lining up along the same direction, then the $209 million treasure theory could take on an entirely different meaning. Perhaps the treasure was never placed directly beneath the money pit. Perhaps the money pit was simply part of a route leading somewhere else, toward a hidden location where the real treasure was supposedly protected. The search for the sealed chamber. This left Rick and Marty with a difficult task. Every new borehole would need to be compared carefully with historical excavation data. The depth would matter. The direction would matter. Even the distance between separate drilling locations could become important. Because if the suspected underground route really does connect the money pit area to another location, the team could potentially be getting closer to something far more significant. A sealed chamber. And when all of the evidence began being viewed together, the underground picture became even more mysterious. Suppose multiple scanning systems, boreholes, and core samples all point toward the same region. Suppose they reveal straight edges, unusual material boundaries, a possible enclosed space, and an apparent void. At that point, the investigation would no longer be focused simply on whether an old tunnel exists. The much bigger question would be, could there actually be a sealed chamber beneath Oak Island? Of course, there is an important reason to remain cautious. Natural geology can produce strange-looking patterns. Rocks fracture, soil layers shift. Underground water moves through different formations and can create cavities or unusual density changes. So a straight line or apparent void, by itself, cannot prove that humans built something underground. But repeated evidence is another matter. If the same unusual pattern appears across several independent tests, the possibility becomes much more interesting. Imagine a confined underground area where the surrounding material has a noticeably different density. Inside that zone, scanning data suggests an empty space. Around the edges, the signals appear to form something resembling a boundary or wall. Then drilling reaches that same depth and brings up unusual wood, stone, or soil that appears to have been disturbed. Suddenly, the possibility of a structured underground space begins to take shape. And that's where the mystery reaches an entirely different level. Because if this really is a man-made chamber, one enormous question remains. Why would anyone go to such extraordinary lengths to construct something so deep beneath Oak Island hundreds of years ago? Creating a large underground structure would have required enormous effort. It would have demanded workers, time, tools, planning, and a very specific reason for going to such lengths. And if something valuable really was placed inside it, then the people who built it may have gone to extraordinary measures to make sure it remained hidden. It would have required enormous effort, careful planning, and a very specific purpose. And if someone later went to the trouble of deliberately sealing such a chamber, then whatever had been placed inside may have been considered extremely valuable or important. That possibility is exactly what makes the $209 million gold treasure theory so compelling. But there is one major problem. The existence of the chamber has not been proven. Before anyone can claim that a hidden vault is actually there, investigators would need much stronger evidence. More drilling, underground cameras, detailed mapping, and physical samples would all be necessary to determine what is really beneath the island. How did metal signals lead to the gold treasure theory? Just when the possibility of an underground chamber seemed to make the story more interesting, another clue entered the picture. Metal signals. If an underground void is detected, that's already intriguing. But if repeated metal readings are also appearing around that same area, the mystery becomes much harder to ignore. The obvious question would be, what exactly is producing those signals? However, there's an important distinction that cannot be overlooked. A metal reading does not automatically mean gold has been discovered. Oak Island has been searched for roughly 230 years. Countless expeditions have taken place there. Old tools, nails, drilling equipment, excavation debris, and other pieces of metal could easily have been left underground by previous searchers. So taking one metal signal and immediately connecting it to a $209 million treasure would be far too early. The real intrigue would begin if the metal readings repeatedly appeared around the same suspected chamber. Imagine that underground mapping identifies what appears to be an enclosed space. Then core samples taken at the corresponding depth reveal evidence consistent with ancient human activity. And finally, metal detection at several different points inside that same limited area produces strong responses. Now the team would have three separate clues apparently converging on one location: a possible structure, ancient evidence, and metal. That combination would make the treasure theory considerably more exciting. Because if the metal isn't simply leftover material from previous treasure hunts, then what could actually be generating the signals? Could it be gold, silver, ancient coins, ceremonial objects, weapons, or historical artifacts whose true value might be impossible to measure in dollars alone? But another issue would immediately arise. How much metal is actually there? Finding one or two metallic objects is completely different from discovering a chamber filled with precious metals. And this is where the sensational $209 million figure would face its biggest test. The team would first need to establish the precise depth and location of the signals. Then they would have to determine what kind of metal is actually responsible for them. If repeated signals inside the suspected chamber were eventually proven to come from precious metals, Oak Island's centuries-old mystery could suddenly reach an extraordinary turning point. Where did the $209 million figure come from? That brings us to the number that has made this theory so dramatic: $209 million. But where did that figure actually come from? Did the team already recover $209 million worth of gold from underground? No. And understanding that distinction is extremely important. A figure like this would represent a potential valuation based on assumptions, not a confirmed discovery. To estimate the possible value of a buried treasure, researchers would first need to understand the size of the suspected chamber. If underground mapping could provide approximate measurements for its length, width, and height, investigators might then estimate how much usable space exists inside. The next factor would be the metal evidence. If strong signals appear at multiple locations within the suspected chamber, one possible interpretation could be that the area contains more than a single metallic object. Perhaps there could be a collection of coins, valuable artifacts, gold bars, jewelry, or other historical objects. But there's still a major unknown. A detector cannot simply announce whether the material underground is gold, silver, or ordinary iron. That would require physical testing. This is where different treasure scenarios begin to emerge. Suppose researchers estimate that the chamber could potentially hold a substantial collection of gold coins, precious metal objects, or other valuable artifacts. By combining an assumed quantity with historical values and current gold or silver prices, investigators could generate a theoretical value for the entire discovery. And under certain assumptions, a number as high as $209 million could emerge. But the most important word here is estimate. It does not mean a $209 million treasure has been confirmed. Until the suspected chamber is safely accessed, the objects inside are physically recovered, and the metal is scientifically analyzed, the true value remains unknown. For now, the $209 million figure belongs to the theory, not the evidence. And that leaves one enormous question hanging over Oak Island. If there really is a sealed chamber beneath the island, what will be waiting inside when the team finally reaches it? Until the suspected objects are actually recovered, their quantity is confirmed, and their composition is scientifically verified, the $209 million figure will remain nothing more than a possible valuation. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the story so compelling. Because there are two very different outcomes waiting at the end of this investigation. If the chamber is eventually opened and investigators discover nothing more than old iron tools, drilling equipment, or debris left behind by previous searchers, the $209 million theory could collapse almost instantly.